Thank you so much. So last but not least, Ryan Shandler. He's a PhD candidate at the School of Political Sciences at the University of Haifa, holds a Bachelor of Laws from Melbourne University, Australia, and an MA in Peace and Conflict Management from the University of Haifa. And obviously, it's important that I would note that he worked in civil society for the last 5 years, Association for Civil Rights in Israel, Hand in Hand, Center for Jewish Arab Education in Israel. So actually, I think you should have been speaking first, right? But we've decided otherwise. And your actual research focuses on the social, psychological, legal, and human rights implication of internet deprivation and cyber disconnection.
That's right.
So, go ahead.
Thank you, and thank you for having me. I want to ask a question that I feel like we're dancing around a lot. That is, can internet access itself be a human right? Under what conditions can internet access be a human right? And the context of that discussion comes due to a concerning new paradigm, where on the one hand, we're witnessing real social and personal dependence on internet access to realize basic human rights and civil tasks. And on the other hand, we're observing a period of real cyber vulnerability where our internet access can be disconnected on a whim and severed through a multitude of different mechanisms. We talk a lot about how pervasive internet access is a net positive for society, how it democratizes communication, and how it allows people who are otherwise excluded from the public and social discourse a voice that they otherwise wouldn't have. And it really does provide a new avenue for realizing basic human rights that in the past may have not been so easy to realize. But there's a cost to this ease of access, and that cost is that when you concentrate all of the possibilities for realizing human rights in a single channel, then it becomes very risky. And the most extreme possible implication of this is that internet access itself could become a human right, because there's an open question whether or not internet access, whether the avenue of internet access to realize human rights is supplementing traditional offline avenues, or whether it's supplanting it completely. And if it is supplanting it, and we find that that you can't realize basic human rights without internet access, then what does that mean for the nature of internet access? It gains a status that it otherwise wouldn't hold. Now, what I want to discuss today is to look at both sides of this paradigm, to consider the nature of our cyber vulnerability, two options of which we heard from the other speakers, and then to look at the other side of the paradigm, which is the nature of our cyber dependence. And then finally, I want to propose a new empirical methodology, which I think is missing from this, a psychological methodology, to measure quantitatively what is the consequences of internet deprivation, both on the individual level, what happens when you're deprived of internet, how do you respond emotionally, and also on the social level. What does it mean for society when we're disconnected for prolonged periods of times, when these avenues that we just heard about now, when the kill switch is activated, what are the implications for that? Now, when we talk about cyber vulnerability, we're talking about something real. We're talking about something that is multifaceted and tangible and is happening in more than 100 countries around the world through a variety of different mechanisms. And it's affecting tens of millions of different people. The most visible danger is cyber attack, and we hear about that a lot. And while we haven't seen the really catastrophic, devastating, military-led cyber attacks on civilian institutions, on the nuclear hubs, on water and electricity grids that we hear a lot about, we have seen instances where cyber attacks have been led by militaries that are targeting civilian infrastructure. And the examples that we heard today were Estonia and Georgia, and more recently Ukraine as well in 2014, where civilian populations were disconnected from the internet. The other example of where we're seeing cyber attacks depriving people of internet access is through the criminal field, is through some of the ransomware attacks that we've seen in the last year, like Petir and WannaCry, where more than 500,000 people in 150 countries had their files locked and had their internet access deprived for periods of between 1 day and a number of weeks. And the reason why this is possible is because cyber warfare is an asymmetrical tool, that resources that were once only at the disposal of government institutions and military bodies can now be wielded by private actors and by criminal enterprises, which means that the ability to deprive people of internet is no longer a tool that's held at the hand of states. The digital divide has fallen a bit out of fashion, but it still is a real way that more and more as services are moving online, that e-government takes hold. The portions of the population, the segments of the population that don't have access to internet, that need it, are those that are already excluded, the poor, the elderly, with certain disabilities. And when you can't access the internet to realize your rights, then this creates another mechanism where people don't have access, where people can be disconnected from the services that they need. Network shutdowns, this is the kill switch that we were just talking about, which can range from full shutdown of the underlying internet infrastructure, but it can also be targeted. As we heard, it can be targeted against WhatsApp, against VoIP, against Skype, and it's being wielded. It's too tempting a tool for governments not to wield it to disperse protest in their own country. And this means that the risk of being disconnected from the internet isn't just coming from external borders, isn't coming from other governments, isn't coming from the digital divide. It can come internally from your own country. And the last one, and this has been in the media a lot in the last year, is the idea of criminal punishment. That convicted criminals, historically certain convicted criminals, have been disconnected from the internet. We're talking here about sex offenders and people who have been prosecuted for national security crimes. And the idea behind it, the principle, is that you're disconnected while behind bars, so that you can't continue to perpetrate the same crime by accessing it through the internet. But in recent years, we're seeing a trend where more and more people, where they're extending this disconnection to other segments of prisoners, and also to the sex offenders when they're released from prison as well. Now, when we send someone to prison, we deprive them of their liberty, we deprive them of certain rights, but we don't deprive them, say, of their right to free expression, of their right to access information. And so by denying this right, courts around the world have struck down these laws. Specifically, I'm thinking India and the UK and the Supreme Court of America a few months ago. They unanimously struck down a law in North Carolina. This was Packingham versus North Carolina, some of you might remember it, where it was a state law that denied internet access to convicted sex offenders upon their release from prison. It denied them access to social media. And the court struck down the law unanimously, and the language that they used was really powerful. This was Justice Kennedy, speaking for the majority, talked about internet access as, social media specifically, as the new public square. They talked about how it had transformed civic life, how it amplified your voice to be a town crier more than you ever could while standing on Speaker's Corner at Hyde Park in London, that it had changed the entire nature of what it means to communicate. So this is a cyber vulnerability side, that we're talking tens of millions of people through multiple avenues, by your own state depriving you, by going to prison, by a cyber attack through the digital divide. This is a real threat to people around the world. Now, on the other side of the equation is the nature of our cyber dependence. Now, much of the research, of the empirical research on what it means to be dependent on internet is from the psychological field, where there's been a lot of studies that show a stark correlation between internet deprivation and stress, and anxiety and depression and social exclusion. And there's a raging debate going on about whether there is such thing as internet addiction, according to the medical definition of the term. And while they debate that, there are already internet addiction centres that are popping up around the world, most of which, interestingly, are in South Korea. But we're going to put this aside for the moment, because as interesting as it is, it's much more interesting to us. What does it mean for us to be dependent on the internet in order to realise human rights? When you think about the classical human rights, freedom of expression, association, information, some of the more modern ones, employment, education, the right to personal and national development, what's the nature, what's the involvement of internet access in the manifestation of these rights? When you think about freedom of expression, we're talking about political expression, we're talking about social discourse. How does that occur in the modern age, if not online through social media? The classical example of how freedom of expression manifests is by writing letters to the editor, newspapers. And in Israel, I know, and in a lot of major American newspapers as well, they'll only accept online submissions to the editor. If you try and post a handwritten letter to the editor, they'll reject it. You can only submit online, which means that if you want to participate in the political discourse in the modern age, you're required to have internet access. When you think of freedom of association, many demonstrations, we're seeing this today in the media every day, demonstrations and protests take place entirely online today. And the court has extended their protections to the congregations of people to online congregations. And for the classical physical gatherings, they're now motivated. They're now publicized online. You no longer see posters on street corners calling people to come to demonstrate. You need to have an internet access to realize this right. And freedom of information is the most obvious, because as e-government takes hold and the information that the government is holding on trust for the people moves exclusively online, then you can't fulfill this right. You can't access the information that's your right without it. I'm talking here about court judgments. I'm talking here about legislation, about committee hearings, and more than that, that without internet access, you can't really fulfill this right. And this is a problem. It's a problem, and I've got a quote here, I think, from Talent 2, just because it's been so talked about today, that the enjoyment of certain economic, social and cultural rights is increasingly dependent on cyber activities. And I'll tell Michael and Deborah that I think this is one of the great understatements. But it's mainly due to the fact that the evolution of technology is moving at such a pace that by the time a report comes out, it's overtaken by events on the ground. And just in the last few years, we're becoming more and more dependent on internet access. And in the report, as it's been mentioned here a few times, they didn't take a strong position on whether internet access could be a human right. They were wary. I think the exact phrasing was that we couldn't, the panel, the committee could not reach consensus on whether internet access is or could be a human right. And I applaud that wariness, because human rights isn't a status that we just throw out to any new technology. Even Cerf would have a fit, because he claims that internet is just technology that enables the realization of human rights. But my argument is that more than just enabling human rights, it's changed the nature of what those human rights are. And when it changes the nature, then it can attain the status of a human right. And this isn't a novel claim. A lot of different scholars have asserted that internet access could be a human right, and through a number of different ways. They've claimed that Article 17 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the ICCPR, which asserts that the right to impart information regardless of frontier and through any means, can be extended in the modern age to internet access, and that's sufficient coverage. Other scholars have claimed that international customary law is becoming sufficient because a number of states are protecting human rights under legislation, because the Human Rights Council has called for a human rights approach to internet access, and that together this can form enough of an argument to show why it's a human right. But people tend to be skeptical of this, and my proposal is a different avenue for why it could be a human right, and that's that it could become an auxiliary right, an auxiliary or a derived human right, which is a secondary right that enables the realization of the primary rights. The primary rights in question here being freedom of expression, association, information, and potentially others. And we set, because we're wary of just applying human rights status to everything, we set a real high burden. We claim that to be an auxiliary right, internet access would need to be so inextricably intertwined with the primary right that without internet access, the primary rights would no longer have any substance. And the classical example of auxiliary rights and derived rights are the right to habeas corpus, which gives substance to the right to liberty, and the right to a free media, which is a modern manifestation of the right to free expression. So how do we test this? How do we test normatively or quantitatively whether there is such inextricable intertwining? In some cases it's easy. If all the information that the government holds on trust for the public is online, and you can't access it any other way, then it's inextricably intertwined. But in most of the cases, it's not that simple. In most of the cases, the offline avenues of realizing these rights are still available. They're just somewhat antiquated or inaccessible, or younger generations that have grown up without internet access don't know how to use them. So what we've done is we decided to run an experiment. I called it the scavenger hunt experiment. We invited participants to a lab environment. This was the school library in the University of Haifa, and we divided them into a control group and a treatment group. The control group had access to all resources, including internet access, and the treatment group had access to everything on their person and in the environment, apart from any internet accessible tools. And we gave them tasks that simulated the modern manifestation of the three rights in question. For freedom of expression, we asked them to express themselves on a political issue that we gave them, such that their opinion reaches a wide audience. For freedom of information, access to information, we asked them to find out which Israeli member of government initiated a law that had been in the press a few months earlier. And we coded the ability to achieve the rights according to a 4-point measure. And what this gave us the ability to do was to quantify the effect of internet deprivation in terms of realizing human rights. Now, before I go to the statistics, and I'm going to breeze through them because I know that lawyers don't like a lot of psychological statistics here, when we found that 100% of the control participants fulfilled the tasks by using internet, because when you want to find out information, you go to Google. When you want to express yourself, you go onto Facebook or you go onto Twitter. But the treatment subjects, when we gave them the tasks, although there were a few that found very creative solutions of how to express themselves publicly, they would stand on the table in the library and start talking, and the librarian would have to pull them down. Most people were stumped. They had no conception. They couldn't conceive of how to express themselves. What does it mean to express themselves to a public audience without internet access? And more than being stumped, they grew emotional and angry and irritated, and we could measure that change in their emotions just from a period of a 1 hour deprivation. Now we found our analysis strategy, and I'll breeze through this because it's terrible to have a lot of statistics up here, is that only 12% of treatment participants were able to achieve all the rights compared to more than 50% of the control group. But we also found a really significant correlation between the control treatment variable and between the ability to successfully achieve the rights. And even when we held, we used a t-test and a chi-square test to look at the expected versus observed outcome. And then when we ran an aggression analysis, we looked at other potential variables that were going to moderate the effect. We thought that perhaps the amount of time you spend online each week would moderate that, perhaps your age or your level of education. But even controlling for all these other variables, we still found that the only indicator of whether you would be able to achieve these rights, the task that reflected the manifestation of rights, was internet access. That's what predicted whether or not you can fulfill your human rights in the modern age. Now the next step for us is to extend this research. I think the quantitative aspect of what internet deprivation means for the public is really missing. We want to extend these experiments and run it for adult audiences as well, in different cities, in different countries, and then to also extend the length of the deprivation, is to prolong it. This is, we measured psychological effects after 1 hour of deprivation. What happens when we extend that to 1 day, to 2 days, to 5 days, to a week? How are people going to respond psychologically? And what does it mean for their ability to participate in a democratic society? Are they going to reacquire the tools that have become quite antiquated, or are they going to break down? Are they going to be able to maintain the connections around them? This is the nature of our research. This is the contribution. I think irregardless of whether we find that the experiment justifies, according to our test, internet access as a human right, reasonable men and women can disagree with the findings because there's no quantitative, there's no threshold after which, if 40% of people can't realize, is that enough to make it a human right? If 80% of people can't realize the rights without internet access, is that a sufficient threshold? So reasonable people can disagree. But what's important is that when we consider the implications of internet deprivation, this isn't just on a national level, this is also on a social level. We tend to focus either on the national level or on the personal level in terms of our psychological response, levels of depression and addiction. But what's not getting enough attention is the nature of our social reliance on internet access, and whether or not, and I direct this towards the government representatives, whether or not this could lead to positive government duties to guarantee internet access for their civilians, to protect their civilians from cyber attack, either internal or abroad, and to provide secure and fast internet if we find that they can't really function as a member of society without internet. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.